Some people think ruining your life happens all at once. Single mistake. A sudden disaster. A moment so loud that everyone hears it break. But most of the time it's quieter than that. It happens slowly, in private, inside your own head. It starts with something small you tell yourself doesn't matter. A thought you ignore. A decision you postpone. A truth you bury so deep that even you forget it's there. Until one day it comes back. These stories aren't about evil people. They're about ordinary people who believed they could live with what they'd done. People who thought honesty would heal them. People who thought silence would protect them. They were wrong. Tonight you'll hear their confessions. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that end with redemption. These are the ones that ended with consequences. This is Reddit Drama Hour. And these are the voices of people who ruined their own lives. I ruined my own life by finally telling the truth. I used to believe that ruining your life was something loud and unmistakable. Something that happened in a single explosive moment that everyone around you could point to and say, "That's when everything went wrong." But I've learned that most lives don't fall apart that way at all. Because most of the damage we do to ourselves happens quietly, patiently, over time, while we convince ourselves that we are still good people who just happen to be carrying something we don't want to look at too closely. For years, I lived inside a version of my life that looked stable, predictable, even happy to anyone standing outside of it. And I became very good at playing the role of someone who had nothing to hide, even though there was always a low, constant pressure in my chest reminding me that my happiness was built on something unfinished, something unresolved, something that would eventually demand to be acknowledged. The truth I carried didn't feel dangerous at first, because when it entered my life it came quietly, without drama or intention, during a time when everything still felt flexible and undefined, before promises were made out loud, before rings were exchanged, before our lives became so tightly intertwined that pulling one thread would unravel everything else. I told myself over and over again that timing mattered more than honesty, that context softened consequences, that the past should stay buried if the present was peaceful. And for a long time, that belief allowed me to wake up each morning, kiss my partner goodbye, and step into the world pretending I wasn't standing on something fragile. But guilt has a way of maturing as you do. It grows alongside you, gaining weight and complexity, changing shape until it no longer fits into the small mental box you originally built to contain it. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it begins to seep into moments that used to feel safe. It showed up when she talked about trust in a casual way, when she spoke confidently about our future, when she laughed without reservation, because each of those moments felt like evidence of something I hadn't earned, something I was receiving under false pretenses. I started to feel like an imposter in my own relationship, like I was living a borrowed life that could be reclaimed at any moment if the truth ever decided to surface on its own. There were nights when I lay awake beside her, listening to the sound of her breathing, staring into the darkness, rehearsing the confession silently in my head, telling myself that I would say it tomorrow, or next week, or after things settled down, or after we reached some invisible milestone that would somehow make the damage smaller. Tomorrow kept moving. Years passed. And during those years, the lie didn't stay contained. It became part of how I understood myself, part of how I justified my own discomfort, part of the reason I flinched emotionally whenever honesty came too close to the surface. I began to resent the truth, not because it was painful, but because it waited so patiently, because it never rushed me, because it allowed me to believe I was in control, when in reality it was only gathering strength. The night I finally told her wasn't dramatic or intentional, which somehow makes it worse in hindsight, because there was no moment I can point to and say this is when I lost control. Only a quiet evening where the air felt heavier than usual, where the silence between us felt less like comfort and more like pressure, and where the words escaped me before fear could stop them. As soon as I started speaking, I knew there was no turning back, And yet there was a strange calm that washed over me, a brief and dangerous sense of relief that convinced me, for just a moment, that maybe this was what honesty was supposed to feel like. That illusion lasted only seconds, because then I saw her face change in a way that still haunts me, not with anger or disbelief, but with a kind of devastating clarity, as if the final piece of a puzzle had quietly slid into place and rewritten everything she thought she knew about the person sitting in front of her. She didn't interrupt me, didn't argue, didn't demand details, and that silence felt heavier than any confrontation could have, because it told me she was already somewhere else emotionally, already distancing herself from the version of me she thought she had married. When I finished speaking, there was a long pause, and in that pause I felt the weight of every year I had chosen silence over honesty, every moment where I had protected myself instead of trusting her with the truth. She stood up slowly, walked into the bedroom without looking back, and closed the door behind her. And that sound, soft, final, unmistakable, marked the beginning of a life I didn't recognize anymore. That night, sleep felt impossible. Not because I was afraid of being alone, but because I knew that even if she stayed, even if she tried to forgive me, nothing would ever feel unbroken again. And some damage doesn't announce itself immediately. It just settles in quietly and changes the shape of everything that comes after. The days that followed were surreal, filled with practical conversations that felt strangely detached from the emotional reality underneath them, as if we were discussing someone else's life instead of our own. And every question she asked chipped away at the fragile hope that honesty would somehow save us. When she left, it wasn't dramatic. There was no final argument, just absence. Friends drifted away with uncomfortable politeness. Family members stopped responding entirely, and I watched my social world collapse not with explosions, but with silence, one unread message at a time. The hardest part wasn't losing my marriage, or even losing the people connected to it. The hardest part was realizing how quickly identity changes once the truth is known, how easily you become a cautionary tale instead of a person, and how little space there is for nuance when trust is broken. I thought telling the truth would make me feel lighter. Instead, it stripped me down to something raw and exposed, forced me to sit alone with the consequences of my own decisions, and taught me that some truths don't free you at all. They just teach you how heavy honesty can be when it arrives too late. Part 2. I confessed to feel better, and lost the only person who knew me. I used to think that guilt was something sharp and obvious, something that stabbed you immediately after you did something wrong. But what I learned instead is that guilt is patient, that it knows how to wait quietly in the background of your life, letting you believe you've escaped it, until one day it becomes so heavy that carrying it feels harder than facing whatever punishment you imagine honesty might bring. The betrayal itself didn't happen in a moment that felt important enough to remember forever, which is part of what makes it so unbearable now, because there was no dramatic scene, no conscious decision to destroy anything, only a series of small, careless choices that felt insignificant at the time and irreversible once they were done. He was my best friend, the kind of person who knew the worst versions of me and stayed anyway, the kind of person whose presence felt permanent, reliable, immune to the kinds of fractures that ruin other relationships. And I think that belief, the belief that some bonds are unbreakable, is what made me careless in the first place. It started during a period when his life was quietly unraveling, when he leaned on me for support, when conversations stretched late into the night, and lines blurred in ways I pretended not to notice, because acknowledging them would have meant stopping, and stopping would have required more self-control than I was willing to exercise at the time. I told myself I wasn't hurting anyone, that this was temporary, that nothing meaningful would come of it, and that justification followed me like a shadow, comforting me just enough to let me sleep at night, even as something inside me began to harden. The guilt didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, showing up in subtle ways. Like the way my laughter sounded forced when we were all together, or the way I avoided his eyes when he spoke about trust, or the way silence felt heavier than usual whenever his name appeared on my phone. I began to live with two versions of myself, the person he believed I was, and the person I knew I had become. And maintaining that separation took more energy than I expected, more emotional effort than I had prepared for, until eventually the weight of pretending felt unbearable. There were moments when I considered never telling him, moments when I convinced myself that silence was a kindness, that confessing would only shift the pain from me onto him. But those thoughts always ended the same way, with the realization that I wasn't protecting him at all. I was protecting myself. Guilt has a way of reframing itself as morality if you let it. It whispers that confession is noble, that honesty is brave, that coming clean will restore balance. And when I finally decided to tell him, I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing, not because it would hurt less, but because it felt necessary for my own survival. The conversation itself was quiet, painfully ordinary, which somehow made it worse, because life didn't pause or signal that something irreversible was about to happen. And as I spoke, watching his expression change in slow, subtle ways, I realized too late that no amount of careful wording could soften what I was admitting. I expected anger. I expected shouting, accusations, questions that spiraled into arguments I could at least participate in. What I didn't expect was calm. He listened without interrupting, without reacting in the way I had rehearsed in my head 100 times. And that calm felt like standing in the center of a room where all the oxygen had quietly disappeared. When I finished, there was a long silence, and in that silence I felt exposed in a way I never had before. Like I had voluntarily handed someone the sharpest tool they could use to hurt me, and then waited for the impact. Instead, he nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully, and said, in a voice so steady it felt unreal, that he didn't want me in his life anymore. There was no dramatic exit, no final insult, no emotional release. Just a boundary drawn so cleanly and decisively that it left no room for negotiation, no illusion of reconciliation, no hope that time might soften his decision. In that moment, I realized something terrifying about honesty. It doesn't guarantee forgiveness, and it doesn't promise closure. And sometimes it simply gives people the information they need to walk away without looking back. Losing him didn't happen all at once either. It unfolded gradually in the days and weeks that followed, as routines dissolved, messages went unanswered, and places we used to go together became reminders of a version of my life that no longer existed. I found myself reaching for my phone during moments of habit, only to remember that there was no one on the other end anymore, no familiar presence to ground me, no shared history to fall back on. The loneliness that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, and deeply personal. It showed up in the realization that I had lost not just a friend, but the last person who truly knew me, the last witness to my life before it fractured into something smaller and lonelier. I started replaying the confession over and over in my head, wondering if different words would have changed the outcome, if timing mattered, if honesty delivered differently could have spared me this loss. But every version ended the same way, with the understanding that some truths, once spoken, permanently alter how you are seen. The worst part wasn't that he hated me. It was that he didn't. His indifference felt heavier than anger ever could, because it told me that I was no longer worth the emotional effort, that whatever we had shared had been overwritten by a single defining moment. I had confessed to feel lighter, to feel clean, to feel like myself again. Instead, I was left with the realization that honesty doesn't erase guilt. It just redistributes it, leaving you to carry the aftermath alone, without the comfort of the relationships you hoped might survive. Some nights, I still wonder who I would be if I had stayed silent. If I had chosen to live with the guilt instead of the consequences. And that question follows me into sleep like a shadow I can't outrun. Because the truth didn't save me. It just showed me what I was willing to lose in order to stop feeling guilty. Part 3. I discovered a family secret and destroyed what was left. I used to believe that families were held together by love, or loyalty, or shared history. But what I understand now, after everything that happened, is that most families survive because of silence, because of the unspoken agreements people make to stop asking certain questions, to stop digging in places where answers might exist that peace does not. The secret didn't announce itself dramatically, and it didn't feel important at first, which is perhaps the cruelest part of the entire story, because if I had known what it would cost me, I might have turned away before curiosity carried me too far to stop. It was something small, almost insignificant, a message on an old device that I wasn't even sure still worked, a leftover artifact from a time when passwords were reused and privacy felt less fragile. And when I first saw it, I remember feeling more confused than alarmed, because it didn't immediately fit into the version of my family that I had always believed in. I read it once, then again, and with each pass, something shifted quietly inside me, like a floor giving way under careful footsteps, because the words carried implications that extended far beyond the screen, implications that reached backward into my childhood, and forward into every relationship I thought was built on trust. I didn't want to believe it, not because it was unbelievable, but because believing it meant re-evaluating memories that had always felt safe, memories that had formed the foundation of how I understood my parents, my upbringing, and myself. At first, I told myself there had to be an explanation, some reasonable context I was missing, some misunderstanding that would dissolve the moment I asked the right question. But doubt has a way of sharpening curiosity rather than calming it. And once the idea took root, it refused to stay quiet. I started noticing things I had never questioned before. Small inconsistencies in stories, awkward pauses in conversations, the way certain topics were redirected without explanation. And with each observation, the weight in my chest grew heavier, as if my body understood the truth long before my mind was ready to accept it. I didn't plan the confrontation. I didn't rehearse it. I didn't prepare myself for the possibility that I might be wrong, or worse, that I might be right. I just asked. And in that moment, I crossed a line I didn't know existed. A line that once crossed cannot be uncrossed, because asking the question alone was enough to signal that I was no longer willing to participate in the illusion that had protected us all for so long. The room went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath, and the silence that followed my question told me everything before anyone spoke a word, because people who have nothing to hide don't freeze the way they did. When the truth finally emerged, it didn't come all at once, and it didn't come cleanly, but in fragments, half answers, justifications, and carefully chosen phrases that sounded rehearsed, as if this conversation had been anticipated for years, but never expected to actually happen. What hurt the most wasn't the content of the secret itself, but the realization that it had been carried quietly through my entire life, that decisions had been made on my behalf without my knowledge, and that the version of my family I believed in had always been incomplete. I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner, angry for being excluded, and deeply unsettled by how normal everything had felt, until the moment it didn't. I reacted emotionally, which I now understand was inevitable, because learning something that rewrites your past leaves very little room for calm, rational thought. And once the words were out, once accusations replaced questions, the conversation stopped being about understanding and became about damage control. I said things I can't take back, not because they were untrue, but because they were sharp, raw, and delivered without compassion, fueled by a sense of betrayal that felt personal and absolute. I demanded explanations. I demanded accountability. I demanded honesty that had been withheld for so long that it no longer knew how to exist in the open. What I didn't understand at the time was that I wasn't just exposing a secret. I was dismantling a structure that had been holding everyone together, flawed as it was, and once it collapsed, there was nothing underneath it to replace it. After that night, everything changed, but not in obvious ways. There were no dramatic fallouts, no screaming matches, no ultimatums. Instead, there was distance. Conversations became careful, shallow, guarded. Family gatherings felt tense and restrained, filled with pauses where laughter used to be, and glances that carried entire conversations without words. The secret was never spoken about again, but it was everywhere. It sat at the table with us. It lingered in every unanswered question. It shaped every interaction like an invisible barrier no one was willing to acknowledge. I found myself questioning whether I should have stayed silent, whether ignorance would have been kinder, whether knowing the truth was worth losing the warmth and ease that once defined my family. And that doubt followed me relentlessly, because unlike guilt, there was no clear moral resolution to cling to. I hadn't done anything wrong by asking, but I hadn't done anything right either. The version of my parents I trusted no longer existed, replaced by something more complicated and human. And while understanding that intellectually should have brought empathy, emotionally it felt like grief, like mourning people who were still alive but no longer familiar. The hardest part was realizing that I couldn't put the secret back where I found it, couldn't unknow what I now knew, and couldn't rebuild the illusion even if everyone else seemed willing to pretend it was still intact. Sometimes I catch myself longing for the family we were before the truth surfaced, even though I know that version of us was built on omission, and that longing fills me with a quiet shame, because it means part of me would trade honesty for comfort if given the chance. Now, when we sit together, everything feels fragile, as if one wrong sentence could reopen wounds no one knows how to heal. And I live with the awareness that while the secret existed long before I discovered it, I was the one who forced it into the open, and that choice will always define my place within my own family. I didn't mean to destroy what was left. I only wanted to understand. But sometimes understanding doesn't bring peace. Sometimes it just leaves you standing in the ruins of something that can never be rebuilt the way it was. Part 4. One honest sentence cost me my career. I used to believe that honesty was a kind of armor, that if you told the truth clearly and calmly, and without excuses, the world would respond with fairness, or at the very least with respect. But what I learned instead is that honesty is only valued when it is convenient, and the moment it threatens comfort, hierarchy, or reputation, it becomes a liability that people are eager to remove. For a long time, my job wasn't just my work. It was my identity, the thing I pointed to when I needed to justify long hours, missed family events, and the quiet exhaustion that followed me home each night. And because of that, I believed that doing the right thing inside that system mattered. That integrity would be recognized even if it wasn't immediately rewarded. The mistake I made wasn't dramatic or catastrophic, and that detail still torments me, because if it had been obvious, if it had caused immediate damage, the outcome might have felt deserved, understandable, even fair. But instead it was small, technical, the kind of error that disappears quietly when no one is looking, leaving no trace behind. I noticed it late one evening, alone at my desk, when the office had already emptied, and the hum of fluorescent lights made the space feel strangely hollow. And as I stared at the screen, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the internal debate that always comes before a difficult decision, where you weigh consequences against principles and tell yourself that choosing correctly shouldn't feel this complicated. At first, I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that fixing it quietly would spare everyone unnecessary stress, that pointing it out might create problems where none needed to exist. And that logic followed me for several minutes, almost convincing me to stay silent and move on. But something about that felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just subtly dishonest. And that discomfort grew heavier the longer I ignored it, until eventually the thought of pretending it didn't exist felt worse than whatever consequences honesty might bring. So I said something. One sentence. Carefully worded. Calm. Professional. I brought it to the attention of someone above me, expecting a conversation, maybe a correction, maybe even a quiet acknowledgement that doing the right thing mattered. What I didn't expect was how quickly the atmosphere changed. The reaction wasn't gratitude or appreciation, but discomfort, followed by a series of questions that felt less like curiosity and more like an interrogation, as if by pointing out the mistake I had shifted from responsible employee to potential threat. Suddenly, the focus wasn't on the issue itself, but on me. Why I noticed it. Why I chose to mention it. Whether it could have been handled differently. Whether the first understood the implications of what I was suggesting. Each question carried an unspoken message. This is inconvenient, and you are the source of that inconvenience. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to surface. Changes small enough to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore when viewed together. Like being excluded from meetings I used to attend, receiving vague feedback that didn't align with my performance history, and feeling a quiet shift in how people spoke to me. Less openly, less comfortably. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if I had misunderstood the situation, if I had overreacted, if honesty had been naive instead of admirable. The tension reached its peak during a meeting that felt ordinary on the surface, but beneath that normalcy carried the weight of decisions that had already been made without me. And as I sat there listening, I realized with a slow, sinking clarity that I was no longer part of the future they were planning. When the conversation finally turned to me, it was framed as a matter of fit, of direction, of organizational needs. Language carefully chosen to sound neutral while erasing responsibility. And in that moment I understood that my honesty hadn't protected me. It had marked me. Losing the job didn't happen explosively. There was no raised voice. No accusation. Just paperwork, polite phrases, and a meeting that ended sooner than I expected, leaving me alone in a room that suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else's life. Walking out of the building for the last time felt surreal. Not because I was shocked, but because I was trying to reconcile the story I had always told myself about integrity with the reality unfolding in front of me. A reality where doing the right thing had quietly disqualified me from staying. What followed was a period of deep, unsettling uncertainty, where every job application felt heavier than the last, where interviews carried unspoken questions about why I had left, and where I learned how carefully people listen for signs of someone who might disrupt comfort in the name of honesty. Friends told me I did the right thing, that I should be proud, that things would work out. And intellectually, I agreed with them. But pride doesn't pay bills, and morality doesn't guarantee security. Late at night, when the reassurance faded, I found myself wondering whether silence would have saved me, whether keeping my head down would have allowed me to keep the life I had worked so hard to build. And that question haunted me because there was no clear answer that felt entirely honest. The hardest part wasn't losing the job. It was losing faith in the idea that integrity is always rewarded, because once that belief cracks, it becomes difficult to know when honesty is courage and when it is self-sabotage. I don't regret telling the truth, but I no longer believe it protects you. Sometimes it simply reveals how expendable you are within systems that value stability over accountability. And that knowledge stays with you long after the career you lost has faded into memory. Part 5. I told them who I really was and lost everyone. For most of my life, I believed that being accepted was something you earned gradually, carefully, by revealing yourself in pieces that felt safe enough for other people to handle. And so I learned very early how to edit myself, how to soften my edges, how to swallow thoughts before they reached my mouth, and how to become a version of myself that fit comfortably into the expectations of everyone around me. It wasn't that I was lying, at least not in the way people usually think about lies, but rather that I was constantly withholding, constantly adjusting, constantly choosing which parts of myself were acceptable enough to show, and which parts needed to stay hidden in order to keep the peace. And over time that habit became so natural that I stopped noticing how much of myself I was leaving out. The version of me that people knew was agreeable, reliable, easy to understand, and for a long time that felt like enough. Because belonging, even conditional belonging, still feels like safety when you've learned to fear rejection more than loneliness. But carrying a hidden self is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance, constant awareness of how you're being perceived, and a relentless internal filter that asks, over and over again, is this too much? Is this too honest? Is this going to cost me something? And eventually that internal pressure builds until even the smallest interactions feel heavy. There came a point where I no longer recognized myself in the life I was living, where every conversation felt like performance rather than connection, and where the idea of continuing to exist in that edited version of myself felt more unbearable than whatever consequences honesty might bring. I didn't plan a grand reveal. There was no announcement, no dramatic speech. Just a gradual decision to stop hiding, to stop shrinking myself for the comfort of others, and to speak openly when questions were asked instead of offering the familiar, palatable answers people expected. At first, the reactions were subtle. Confusion, awkward pauses, the slight shift in tone when conversations took a direction people weren't prepared for. I told myself this was normal, that people just needed time to adjust, that authenticity always feels disruptive before it feels accepted. But discomfort has a way of revealing itself quickly. People began to pull back. Invitations slowed. Messages became shorter, more polite, less personal. Some people asked questions, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to categorize me again, to decide where I fit now, that the old version of me was no longer available. Others didn't ask anything at all. They simply disappeared. What hurt the most wasn't outright rejection. It was the quiet distancing, the gradual erosion of closeness that happened without confrontation, without explanation, without the opportunity to defend myself or clarify intentions. I found myself replaying conversations in my head, wondering which sentence had crossed an invisible line, which moment of honesty had been too much, and whether there was a way to take it back without losing what little remained. Some people told me they supported me, but their support came with conditions, with boundaries that made it clear which parts of me were acceptable, and which parts were better left unspoken. And I realized then that conditional acceptance is just another form of silence, dressed up to look compassionate. Family gatherings became tense. Friends I had known for years spoke to me carefully, as if I were fragile or unpredictable, and that carefulness created a distance that no amount of time seemed able to close. I wasn't arguing with anyone. I wasn't demanding agreement. I was simply existing more honestly than I had before. And somehow, that was enough to make people uncomfortable. The loneliness that followed was different from any loneliness I had known before, because it wasn't about being physically alone, but about being unseen in a new way. About realizing that the connections I thought were built on understanding had actually been built on convenience and familiarity. There were moments when I questioned everything, when I wondered if authenticity was overrated, if fitting in quietly would have been easier, if the version of myself I had hidden away was worth losing so many relationships. And those thoughts felt especially cruel because they suggested that love and belonging might always come at a price. But there was also a strange clarity in that isolation. A quiet sense of relief that came from no longer monitoring myself, no longer rehearsing responses, no longer apologizing internally for existing the way I did. For the first time, I was alone with myself in a way that felt honest, even if it was painful. I learned that telling the truth about who you are doesn't guarantee acceptance, and it doesn't promise understanding, but it does force people to show you the limits of their love. And while that knowledge can be devastating, it is also real. The people who stayed did so quietly, without conditions or explanations, and though they were fewer than I expected, their presence felt heavier, more meaningful, because it wasn't contingent on silence or performance. I lost people I thought would always be there. I lost versions of relationships that only worked when I was smaller. But I gained something I didn't know I was missing. I gained the ability to exist without apology. And even though the cost was high, even though there are nights when the absence still aches, I no longer wake up feeling like a stranger in my own life. Sometimes ruining the life you had is the only way to stop living a lie. And sometimes losing everyone is the price of finally meeting yourself.